All right, everyone, we're just going to spend a little time learning about the judges, this group of leaders that God raises up to keep the Israelites on track. They weren't what you normally think of when you think of judges. They didn't preside over a courtroom with a jury and different lawyers and a prisoner or anything like that, but they were more of military leaders. They also did some normal kind of judge things. They arbitrated disputes. So when people had a conflict with others, either within their own tribe or between some of the 12 tribes of Israel, they were the ones who settled the arguments, basically the disputes. But they were mostly military leaders, and they did this kind of on a temporary basis whenever Israel needed someone to lead them into battle as they were conquering the Promised Land. They were expected to remind the people of their responsibility toward God, to keep them on track when it came to that covenant. We already know God's always faithful, but they go astray. These judges tried to keep them focused and committed to the covenant. 3 judges that it's important to know, even though there are far more judges than 3, are Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, and we're going to learn a little bit more about them in a bit. Just to give you the general theme of the book of Judges, it's one of the historical books, just like Joshua. It's a historical record of the conquest of the Promised Land. And it tells us that it took about 200 years or so to conquer the Promised Land. That it involved several major battles. And we hear about those and we read about those in the book of Judges. And that the Promised Land actually expanded because of these battles. But it also tells us about something that's known as the cycle of apostasy. This really describes the Israelites' behavior and relationship with God while they are trying to conquer the Promised Land during the period of the Judges. If you don't know what apostasy is, it's the denial of God or the repudiation or rejection of faith. Basically, denying or rejecting God and his influence in your life. This is something that they actually did in a cyclical manner. That means several times. And if you read the book of Judges, you're going to see it over and over again. Here's just a little description of the cycle. First, the Israelites go astray and they sin, typically by worshiping false gods or the gods of the Canaanites, who were polytheistic, and they were neighbors of the Promised Land, so they were all around them. And sometimes they were even friends and things like that, and associating with one another. So they get dragged into or suckered into, or they just end up worshiping these false gods. And then God, as a punishment, allows them to be conquered by their enemies or delivers them into the hands of their enemies. Then, realizing that God is punishing them, the Israelites pray to God for help and deliverance, and they repent and they say they're sorry to God. And then God sends a judge to deliver them from their enemies. So this is one of this group of people, a person from this group that God raises up to deliver them from their enemies, to be their military leader, to save them from whoever may have conquered them or who may have harmed them in any way. And so God really uses these people to save them. But the problem is, once these people die, they go right back to worshiping the false gods again. It's kind of like when Moses went up Mount Sinai and he was gone for 10 days. The Israelites couldn't even handle their relationship with God and focus on their relationship with God without Moses for 10 days. So this is even longer many of the times, and they go astray. Remember when the Israelites worshiped the golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai? It's kind of like that. So they worship false gods. God punishes them for it. They realize they're being punished and apologize, and then God sends them a judge to deliver them. How forgiving is God? And we see this in the book of Judges. To draw a connection with earlier in the Old Testament, we see that the apostasy of the Israelites can kind of be traced back to the sin of Adam and Eve, the original sin, placing other things before God or placing themselves before God, putting your own will before God's will, not being quite as committed to God as He is to you. This, there's a fancy term for that, and it's called concupiscence, but it just refers to our tendency to sin. And so sin still gets in the way. We see that in this cycle of apostasy. Ultimately, however, God's love saves, right? Despite this vicious cycle, God's miraculous, faithful love saves them. He remains steadfast to that covenant even when the Israelites don't. Again and again, He rescues them. And again, He sends leaders, those judges, even when they're a little flawed, to save them. So just to recap, their major sin really is abandoning Yahweh and worshiping the gods of the Canaanites, their polytheistic neighbors. Here are two examples of Canaanite gods, Baal and Astarte, who's his female partner. They had kind of like a male and female partnered gods. And the reason they did this, well, the gods were really a temptation to the Israelites because they saw their Canaanite neighbors worshiping them. And the Canaanites were agrarian people, they were farmers, and so were the Israelites. And when the Israelites asked the Canaanites why their crops were so good and why their land was so fertile, they would attribute it to worshiping those gods. And so the Israelites who wanted good crops too would get kind of wrapped up in that. However, God did continue to send these judges to bring them back on the right track. And so here's one of them. This is a little bit more information about those three that we introduced before. But remember, there's far more than three. Deborah, who is actually a woman. We wouldn't expect maybe a woman to be a military leader, but she is. She's one of the great judges in the Bible. She is sometimes called a prophetess, so it's a woman who is a prophet. And she instructs sort of the general of the Israelites to lead the army in a successful holy war. And the holy war is against Canaanites, basically, who are polytheistic. If you read the 5th chapter of Judges, basically the whole chapter is a poem called The Song of Deborah, describing how Deborah leads them to victory. So just to kind of set the scene for this battle, the Canaanites have conquered Israel, led by their general, whose name is Sisera. Deborah tells her general, Barak, to lead his army against Sisera at a place called Mount Tabor. And Israel wins because, of course, God wants them to, and God has sent Deborah to help them win. Well, in the process, Sisera flees and is killed by a woman whose name is Jael as he's sleeping in her tent. And as a result, the land is at rest for 40 years, so God brings great peace to the land. Here's just a little image of Sisera's death, which was the sign of the victory for the Israelites. Moving on to the next one, Gideon. Gideon's another great judge, and you see him pictured here with an angel appearing to him. Gideon was provided to the Israelites by God when the Midianites had attacked and conquered the Israelites. Remember Midian? That's where Moses fled when he had killed the Egyptian slave driver. The people of Midian conquer the Israelites. And Gideon also, just to make another connection to Moses, Gideon also objected to God's appointment of him as judge, similarly to how Moses wasn't so confident when God asked him to free the Israelites from Egypt. He said, I'm too weak, I'm unworthy. My family is the meanest or the lowest in Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh. And I am the most insignificant even in my father's house. He's basically saying, I'm the lowest of the low. Why do you want me? And he turns the tables on God and says, well, if you're really with us, why did all of this happen? Why did you let this happen to us, Lord? But he is convinced when an angel appears and gives him courage. Important to note, too, Gideon's father was one of the bad guys, not that he was a Midianite, but that he worshipped false gods. And so one of the first things Gideon does to set the tone as a judge is he goes to his father's altar to Baal, that Canaanite god, and destroys it. Gideon tests God as well. So you get a little insight into their relationship here too. Gideon wants to make sure that God is truly calling him to this. And so he tests God 3 different times. First, he asks, "Give me a sign that you are speaking with me." And he sets up these other 2 tasks as well. He says, "Okay, I'm going to put a piece of fleece, so that's like the hair of a sheep, right? I'm going to put this piece of fleece on the ground. And in the morning, I need the dew to be only on the fleece and not on the ground. And then I'll know." And it happens. And then he tests God once more, and he wrings out that wet fleece, that dewy fleece, and he says, "Let the fleece be dry, but the dew be on the ground." And God again makes it happen. So God convinces Gideon again to remain faithful to him. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes we do this too. Sometimes we test God as well. And so I just like to reflect on that sometimes with my students. A little bit more about this defeat of the Midianites. The army of Israelites is quite large at this time, 32,000 people. And Gideon doesn't really understand why God thinks having too many soldiers is a bad thing. But God says, if they win the battle with 32,000, because they outnumber the Midianites, they're going to think that they actually did it by themselves, not without God. Kind of like Moses and Aaron's sin of producing the water from the rock. They really thought it was, they started to convince themselves that they were the ones doing the miracles, not God. So God doesn't want this to happen. So he actually cuts down the Israelite army from 32,000 to 300. So they're not outnumbered. But they defeat Midian. And this really puts the exclamation point on the fact that God is the one doing it. All right? So here's just like a battle, a little scene of the battle with the Midianites. Now, moving on to that third judge that we're going to focus on, Samson. And he's probably the one that you're most likely to have heard of before. In the time of Samson, the Israelites have been conquered by the Philistines, and you've already heard about them. They were the ones that God wanted to avoid when he was bringing them to the promised land because they were such warriors. But God raises up Samson to take charge. When the Bible takes some time to actually write about the birth of a person, that means this is a very special person. And we get, in Judges 13, 1-8, we get a very detailed explanation of the birth of Samson. So this tells us that Samson is going to be set apart for a specific purpose for God. In fact, he's a Jewish person known as a Nazarite. This means that his mother basically consecrated him to God from the womb, set him aside for God, and he went to live in the temple, or not in the temple, he went to live with the priests and learn about the ways of God. And he had to abstain from drinking wine and from having his hair cut. Maybe you've heard of Samson and Delilah? Samson was given the gift of superhuman strength, and here he is depicted wrestling a lion with his bare hands. He was very, very strong. But his weakness was women. His strength was his hair. His weakness was women. He wasn't too bright, and he had a childlike temper. Remember, God can still use people who are not perfect. Well, he ends up marrying a Philistine woman who's the enemy, and he talks to his wedding guests at his wedding about a lion he killed and honey. And if they solve it within 7 days, he's going to give them 30 tunics and 30 sets of garments. If not, they have to pay him that. The Philistines bribe his wife for the answer. And Samson kills 30 Philistines to pay the debt. His wife was given to the best man. Samson burns their fields in anger, and the Philistines then burn her and her family. It gets really ugly. And in fact, his own people end up handing him over to the Philistines, but he kills 1,000 of them with the jawbone of a donkey.